the trust and lay bare the lies. Fill mine with fire, the same fire that's in your eyes. I'm riveted by your glow and the burning that's light.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Refining Exegetics, and happy Tuesday evening to you all, and welcome to tonight's live stream. This is going to be the past a number of Tuesdays. I've been joining Teach Yahweh's channel, Kenesha, and we've been kind of co-hosting and co-streaming discussions related to the important topic of the law, the Torah, and the first century context of Paul and his writings. And we've been having lively discussions related to some of the things that Paul is saying, and I've been giving some presentations, and it's just sort of sparking the important conversations and presenting some of my research and then just sparking conversations regarding the proper understanding of Paul's writings and his context. And we're continuing to do that. But I'm my co-host Kenesha. She has a prior engagement. She's actually streaming and taking part of a debate review tonight from a recent debate of a good brother in the Lord, talking about the topic of the Trinity and biblical Unitarianism and stuff like that. So this is going to be a little bit different. There may not be as much engagement because it'll just be refining exegetics and any of those who happen to stumble upon this live stream tonight. Excuse me. But we are going to continue. I'm going to continue to host a panel for any who come here, and I'll be sharing a few things to open up, and then I will open up and I'll post the stream or post the link to StreamYard so that people who are tuning in and want to discuss the topic can come on and join. So let me go ahead and get that link posted here. 1 second here. And there is the StreamYard link in the live chat. Let me go ahead and pin that. If I can here. Let's see. No, I can't do that from here. Well, I'll get that pinned here shortly. But there it is in the live chat. So as the title suggests, what I'm going to be opening up for discussion is there's a popular topic that gets or a phrase that gets an expression that gets thrown around in discussions related to Paul and justification and the law. And one of those phrases goes something like the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. Now, I've titled this live stream, or the question that we're asking is, what is the letter versus the spirit? And I do that intentionally because there is no such phrase as the letter of the law in the Bible, and either in Paul's writings or anywhere else in the New Testament. It's sort of just an expression that's read into the actual biblical language, which centers around the Greek word grammatos or grammaton, or just the root, gramma, which literally just means letter or something to that effect. And that's in many ways distinct from another Greek word, epistolor, where we get the noun epistle, which there's also that Greek understanding of a letter as like an actual letter that you write, but grammaton has something a little more specific in as it's referent. So let's see. Yeah, again, shalom, Freddie, at 13 above. I appreciate all that you do and getting out there and having lots of live streams, discussions about important topics. Appreciate you very much, brother. Dandelion T7, shalom to you. Welcome. Again, the StreamYard link is posted up there because I will be opening up the panel for any of those interested in joining and discussing what I'm going to be talking about and the important question of what is this letter versus spirit in Paul's writings. So so where I'm going to kick off, let me go ahead and bring us, no, that's not the right one. That was something different. But here we are. I wanted to open us up in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, because this is one of the places where we get a juxtaposition in Paul in his writings between grammaton, and pneuma or spirit, and that appears here in verse 6. This who made us sufficient as ministers of a new covenant, not of gramma, but of pneuma. For gramma kills, but pneuma gives life. And I just want to point out here that up to this point, Paul is not talking about the law. He's been up to this point defending his apostleship and his ministry against accusations from other so-called apostles who are coming in and doing things the way that they there's a certain way that they go about ministering among the Gentiles, and Paul is sort of contrasting his mode of living and ministering with theirs, and he's sort of defending himself. They're coming with letters of recommendations from higher up authorities and from men, sort of like, here, let's commend ourselves to men by coming with letters of recommendation. And actually, Paul used to do that. We'll talk about this more. Paul used to go with carrying letters of recommendation of authority from authorities, and to carry out nefarious things like capturing and putting in prison followers of the way. And he asked for letters. And these people are bringing letters. Well, Paul has sort of died to all that, and he has become a minister in a different way, according to the ministers of the New Covenant, not according to these letters, but he's equating these letters of recommendation that are from men and to men, and he's equating those with gramma, which has to do with written regulations. And these are in contrast to the workings of the Spirit. And so we're going to get into this. Let's see what's going on in there. Freddie says, "Thank you, Jared, for the kind words. Praise God, our Father, and Lord Jesus, our King." By the way, any those watching, I mean, I encourage you to look up at 13 above 9, his channel, and check out what he does. It's super cool. like I said, again, I appreciate you. Let's see. Where do I want to go for here? Didn't exactly, I don't have a created, presentation for all this, but I'm just going to work through this methodically while I wait. If anybody wants to come on and join, you can click the link there. Let's see if I can. Nope. Let's see. I might have to. Well, I'll figure that out later. So, apologize for the just the as I get up to speed here. We'll get up to speed. So, highlighting this, for the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. Now, Paul, again, he's in the space just before this controversial and misunderstood verse 6 and going on into 7, 8, 9, and 10. Just before that, and then after this little section, Paul is defending his ministry and juxtaposing his mode of ministry with others who come in pomp and circumstance, and he's going to describe them as veiling their true intentions. Whereas after this, Paul is going to be saying that they don't veil themselves. Their gospel isn't veiled. They don't hide behind pretenses. They're open. They come openly in weakness, tattered clothes and all, so to speak. And yet that is the means by which the power of the Spirit is displayed. There's room there for the power of the Spirit to come, not with eloquence of words, but with demonstrations of power. And so that's a distinction between what's happening with these other so-called apostles. Shalom, Karen. Welcome to this live stream, and I'm glad you could come in and tune in. Shalom to you. So now we get to, for the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, the question is, or rather, what's often assumed is that Paul is talking about the letter of the law, that apparently these other apostles are coming in and trying to get the Gentiles, these bad Jews, they're coming in to get the Gentiles to obey the law of Moses and be justified by it, and that's bad, because it only brings death. But if you go by the Spirit and you get set free from that horrible burden and oppressive yoke of the law that kills you, so that's the narrative in Western evangelical Christianity, by and large. I'm just being honest. I mean, that's basically that's the narrative that we're conditioned with here in the West. But I want to put forth that inserting that sort of narrative in here completely breaks the narrative and rhetorical flow of Paul's entire arguments in chapters 2 all the way into 4 and 5. Paul is not interrupting his apostleship defense and ministry efforts to now insert a teaching about the deadness or the ineffectiveness of the law of Moses. What Paul, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what we would call midrash. Paul is doing a midrash on a particular passage in Exodus, and whenever he does this, it's for the purpose of implicating his opponents, his theological opponents, in a bad situation to sort of flip the tables. It's a rhetorical bait and switch, so to speak. Now, he's already described his opposition as those who veil themselves. They don't put forth their true intentions. They sort of veil their intentions behind a mask of eloquent speech, but really they're causing divisions. Sort of the same issues that they have that he speaks about in First Corinthians, and he goes to Moses, to a midrash about Moses putting a veil over his eyes, over his face, that is, and referencing gramma that's written on stone. Now that's important because he has just juxtaposed those coming with letters of recommendation with saying that you, Corinthians, you are our letter inscribed in our hearts, being known and being read by all men. And these are inscribed not on ink, letters, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of fleshy hearts. So again, Paul is directly linking epistles, the letters of recommendation, with letters inscribed on stone, and juxtaposing that with the Corinthians being their letter. In other words, the proof, the witness that Paul and his ministry, they're done by the Spirit of God, by the power of God. And these are written on tablets of fleshy hearts. Now, we understand, if we understand the foundation of the Torah, that right from Deuteronomy, the Shema, these words are to be on your hearts. The words that I command you today are to be on your hearts. So though Moses had inscribed commandments on stone, the point is that these are actually to be in your heart. And there's a rhetorical strategy here. Paul is going to go into a midrash and say that he's going to link tablets of stone. In other words, this opposition are coming with hearts of stone. Their hearts are stone. They don't walk according to the Spirit. They're actually not walking in obedience, and they're bringing a message that leads to disobedience, division, strife. He addresses that all through both of Corinthians. There's a lot of strife. There's a lot of messiness. There's a lot of sin and stuff not being addressed. And the reason being is because these people are being enticed by eloquent words and speech and things that lead away from heart obedience to the commandments into disobedience. That's why there's disarray in their midst. So Paul is trying to midrashically implicate the ones who are enticing them in a very unfortunate situation. And he's using this veil imagery to do that. We have to understand that midrashically, Paul is not saying anything against the law of Moses here. He's talking about veils. That's what he's doing. So when it goes on in verse 7, now, if the ministry of death, having been engraved in gramma on stones, into being in glory, so as far the sons of Israel not to be able to look intensely on the face of Moses on account of the glory of his face that is fading away. Let me move this over here for a second. So what is he doing here? What's this ministry of death? Well, the law of Moses is not a ministry of death. In order to address this, really, we have to go to another passage, and let's do that here. We bring up Romans 7. So this is important because we have in Romans 7 the same dichotomy, but now having died, and this is verse 6, Romans 7, verse 6, and 2 Corinthians 3, verse 6 say that pretty much the same thing. But now, having died to what bound us, we have been released from the law. Now, the law that he's talking about is the law of sin and death. That's what he goes on to say in chapter 8. But let's stick here for now, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit, pneuma, and not in the old way of the grammaton. It's the same Greek word there. Now, here it's in many translations says written code or even the law of Moses. No, it's just grammaton, letter. So the old way of the letter. And then he expounds verse 6 later on. But the point that I want to make here is there's an interesting statement that he makes. Verse 13, so verse 12. So then the law, that's the law of Moses, is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. Then he asks rhetorically, did that which is good then become death to me? So here's where we have to really understand the breadth of Paul's theology and cohere his statements with what he says elsewhere. If you're going to say in 2 Corinthians 3, verse 6 or 7, that is, that the ministry of death is the law of Moses, then you run into contradiction, because Paul says here emphatically that the law of Moses did not become death to me. So the law of Moses does not bring death. Certainly not. So what produces death actually is the law of sin and death. Now, why do I know this? Because in verse 23, Paul says, "But I see another law at work in my body, warring against the law of my mind, and holding me captive to the law of sin that dwells within me." So, whatever we are held captive to previously, before walking in the Spirit and being baptized into Christ and raised to new life with Him, it's not the law of Moses that was enslaving us or causing death or bringing death to us. No, there's another law at work in your body. Paul calls this the body of death later on in verse 24. What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body of death? We don't need to be rescued from the law of Moses. Paul never says that. What we need to be rescued from and set free from is, and put to death, is the law of sin. A law that's at work in the members of our body that produces death. That's what we are set free from when we read this passage. Let's see. Let me double check, see if I'm missing anything in the chat here. Dustin, Dr. Dustin Smith, good to see you. Cheeky. You're funny, man. I need to learn from you. Let's see. Yeah, lots of hellos all the way around. Dustin, if you have time, yeah, I'd love to have you on to discuss these things. If you're available, I would love to. Besides, and like I said, I've got if you look up in the chat, I've got the StreamYard link posted there for anybody who would like to join. In fact, you know what? I need to go ahead and pin that. What you need to do is go to here. Bear with me, folks. Okay, that should be good. All right, moving on. So now the reason why I bring us to Romans 7 is, again, we have the juxtaposition between grammaton and pneuma here in relation to what we are set free from and what produces death. Um, and so through this little uh, summary of going through Romans 7, we understand that there's a law that it's at work in us, and that law is related to grammaton in verse 7, and is juxtaposed with the new way of the Spirit. Um, so when we talk about, let me go back to 2 Corinthians 3. When we talk about this ministry of death and the letter kills, Paul tells us what kills, and that is there's a law at work in our members. And simply what Paul is doing here is now he's doing a midrash about these apostles. They're coming in the letter, the written code, or the regulations that they're operating in. They don't produce life. He leaves those. He connects that to a veil that keeps people from seeing the truth in Moses when they go. So there's nothing wrong with Moses in this midrash. The issue is that Moses is veiled to these people. When they read Moses, they don't actually get to understand the life that's therein and the life that it points to, because their hearts are stone. So let's read the midrash. Now, if the ministry of death, having been engraved in letters, this is in verse 7 of 2 Corinthians 3, came into being in glory, so as for the sons of Israel not to be able to look intently into the face of Moses on account of the glory of his face that is fading away. How much more, or how will the ministry of the Spirit not be more in glory? For if the ministry of condemnation was glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory. So the ministry of condemnation, what he's talking about is how Moses had to veil his face. Now, people couldn't look upon the glory of Moses because the people didn't have fleshly hearts who could relate rightly to the instructions, to the words of God. They couldn't look upon, they couldn't draw near to God. Even with the glory that was on Moses, which certainly pales in comparison to the glory of God, but his face was illumined to a degree because of his closeness to that glory. He would come out, and the people would not be able to look intently into the face of Moses. Really, when it's talking about the face of Moses, I mean, they're talking about his presence, the the presence of the words of life that he's bringing to the people. And so a veil, now Paul is saying that now because of that, there's a veil that lays over their eyes, and they can't really see Moses properly, and hence they can't really see the face of Messiah properly. Paul is saying, and he's going to go on to say, that we don't veil our faces. You can see us plainly. We don't come with false pretenses. That's all the rhetorical strategy that's going on here, and we can't separate this midrash from that context. It would be to introduce a narrative and a frame that is anachronistic. So Paul, again, he's not saying things regarding the law of Moses directly. He's doing a midrash. Again, if you're just joining, the StreamYard link to join the panel here is open. Feel free to click on that link, and I can bring you up, and we can discuss and you can share your thoughts, and we could have a great discussion tonight. I don't want to monologue all through this. I could talk all at for a long time about these things because I'm very passionate about this subject, and um, it may seem abstract. I'm talking about the first century. I'm trying to set things in their proper context, but eventually, I mean, we can talk about what's the application. What does this mean for us? Um, but we also had to understand what it meant for them first before we could do that. Um, so moving on in verse 10, for even that having been glorious has no glory in this respect on account of the glory surpassing it. Um, if you're if this doesn't sound familiar to you, it's because I'm reading from the Berean Literal Bible, um, which is maybe somewhat clunky in English. And I may go ahead and just switch to a more common translation, like maybe ESV or something. I'm not really partial to particular translations. It's just what I had up at the time. So, indeed, in this case, what once had glory has come to have no glory at all because of the glory that surpasses it. So, obviously, there was glory with Moses because he had to veil his face, even if that glory was fading. So it's not to say there was no glory at all. It's just this is a point of comparison. It's as if there was no glory at all, comparing to the glory that surpasses that, which is uh, the glory of God in the face of Messiah. For if what was being brought to an end came with glory, much more will what is permanent have glory. So again, there's an idea that Paul is talking about the law here. He's not. What was it that's coming to that was coming to an end or fading? Well, in this instance, it's a glory that was on Moses' face, which again had to be veiled to the people whose hearts were stony. They didn't have fleshly hearts, weren't prepared, didn't have the heart that where these words could be in their hearts. The words are living words. They're meant to be in living hearts. They're not dead words inscribed on dead stones. But it's not compatible with dead stony hearts. It doesn't benefit. It doesn't bring the life that it's promised to bring. But in other words, he's midrashically connecting that fading glory to the outward appearance and pomp and circumstance, so to speak, of Paul's opposing opposition. These other apostles who are bringing different messages. Let me get a drink of water here real quick. Karen's Biblical Unitarian Podcast, new to scriptures, huh? You guys are so funny. Love the banter. We all love you, Dustin. We so appreciate what you do, how you've thrown yourself in fully to make the things that you've spent invested much of your life in. You're making it available to many, and yeah, just God bless you, brother. So, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. Not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. So Paul is now saying that we are very bold, not like Moses. Again, midrashically, he's connecting Moses. When he says Moses, he's talking about somebody. He's talking about the opposition. He's talking about these so-called apostles and their way of ministering. They put a veil over their faces. And this is a midrashic way of saying that the that they don't want the Gentiles to gaze and see the outcome of their ministry. He's saying that that's being brought to an end. In other words, what they're doing is not going to last. It's not going to bear fruit into eternity. It's power from man. It's authority from man. It's coming forth from man and ending with man. Whereas the power and the glory that Paul is bringing is the power from God, and it's with the words that Paul is bringing, the very words, the living words of God. And those words we understand from Scripture that your word will endure forever. So, but their minds were hardened. For to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, that same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. Now understand, is Paul saying that we're not to read Moses or understand Moses? Are we supposed to set Moses aside? No, if we read this closely, what he's saying is that Moses is veiled to the people. And the glory that Moses pointed to, which is the glory that's now we're seeing in the face of Messiah, is veiled. A veil lays over their hearts. But when you turn to the Lord, the veil is removed. So obviously, if it's the veil over Moses, then if they turn to the Lord, that veil is removed and they can understand Moses and therefore understand Jesus. Just like Jesus said to the Pharisees, you look to Moses, you look to the scriptures, and you believe that in them is life, which is true. He doesn't deny that in them is life. He just says that when you're doing that, you don't listen to Moses because you're not coming to me and believing. So I think we just had to read slowly, understand contextually what Paul is saying here, what he's not saying here, because there are implications. There's real theological and practical implications. Paul is not saying here that we set Moses aside. I think the author of Hebrews in chapter 10 says that whoever set aside the law of Moses died on account of two or three witnesses, on the testimony of two or three witnesses. How much more, so to speak, when someone who tramples upon the blood that sanctified them, how much more punishment awaits. So it's not a replacement, it's a how much more. And so going on in verse 16, but when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Let's see. Just checking in the chat here. Cool. All right, have a good one, Freddie. Thanks for stopping in, and however long you can listen in. Bless you. And we all, now who's the we all? If you read closely Paul's use of first and second person pronouns here and there, it would become obvious that we he is a first person plural reference to himself and the other Jewish apostles who are with him, who are ministering, who are his cohorts, so to speak. He's not talking about he's not talking about just Christianity in general. No, this is Paul and the other appointed apostles. And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed to the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So, what can we gather so far about the question? What is grammaton, and why is it juxtaposed with spirit? I would contend that this okay, yeah, this grammaton that kills, or this gramma that kills, is basically a metonym term for man-made attempts to regulate and gatekeep those who are in covenant. That's what I would say here. And the reason why I say that is primarily because, well, that there is a lot to go into to really establish what I'm talking about. We also had to bring in Romans 2, because grammaton is used there as well, and it's connected to directly with a circumcision doctrine. And it's let's go there really quick. I want to show you something. So verse 27, actually, where do I want to? No, that's not right. Yeah. So verse 27 here. And so let's back up to verse 26. Therefore, if the uncircumcision, so this is speaking of a Gentile, he's previously in chapter 2, he's been referring to Gentiles who, though not having law, nonetheless keep the requirements of the law. And I made arguments elsewhere that Paul is referencing Gentiles who aren't obligated, or who haven't placed themselves in obligation to Jewish regulations relating to purity. There's a set of Jewish regulations that Paul calls law in other places. When, for instance, Peter says in Acts 10, to Cornelius, that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with a Gentile or enter his home. That he's not referencing the law of Moses there, but unlawful in the sense of Jewish law. And Paul is here juxtaposing Gentiles who are without Jewish law, nonetheless have the law written on their hearts, and they're doing the righteous requirements of the law, even though they're uncircumcised. And so if an uncircumcision keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be reckoned as circumcision? Now, this is understanding, going back to the foundation of Deuteronomy, and as well as the prophets. A circumcised heart is both the effect and the foundation for walking according to the commandments and walking in step with God and loving God, is having a circumcised heart. Now, a circumcised flesh for an Israelite was an outward manifestation that points to what the law is meant to do and use to circumcise your heart. So even though somebody is uncircumcised, if they're obedient and they're keeping the requirements of the law, their uncircumcision will be reckoned as circumcision because they understand that that they're circumcised of heart. And conversely, the uncircumcision by nature, fulfilling the law, will judge you who through grammaton and circumcision are a transgressor of the law. Now, this is an interesting thing that Paul is saying. Paul is saying that through grammaton and circumcision, a person becomes a transgressor of the law. Why is that? Why is through letter, through grammaton, a person becomes a transgressor of the law? Well, that's because earlier in Romans 2, if you read just the rhetorical flow of this section and into chapter 3, that a person who is relying on outward circumcision while disobeying the requirements of the law is actually through that circumcision, through that regulation, and through that letter, it's the letter that's actually causing them to transgress the law. So this brings up another critical point in my presentation, and what I hope I would love people to join the panel here. Again, the StreamYard link is there pinned in the chat if you'd like to come up and talk about it. One of my key points that I really want people to see here is that we need to get away from this outdated idea, this mindset that there's this letter of the law that you can do, and it's not good enough. You can't just do the letter of the law. You got to do the spirit of the law, and that sort of gets us away from Paul's argument here. The letter is not have anything in reference to the law of Moses, because it's this person's reliance on letter that causes him to transgress the law. If the letter is the law, why would doing the law cause you to transgress the law? That doesn't make any sense to me. What I believe is going on here is that a reliance on a regulation, a man-made tradition, leads to setting aside the commandments for the sake of practicing a tradition. Did not Yeshua rebuke Pharisees in their practice of the very same thing in places like Mark 7, Matthew 15? You neatly set aside the commandments of God so you can practice your tradition. That seems to be exactly what the interlocutor here that Paul is engaged with in this diatribe, that seems to be exactly what his interlocutor is doing. Karen says, is Paul not combating the Pharisees' oral law, tradition, and doctrine of men in all his letters, same as Messiah? I would say so. I mean, I really hope that becomes evident. I mean, as you can see, many people are connecting the dots here. I'm not the only one. I'm not making this up. People are seeing a through line, a direct through line from Yeshua and his confrontations with the Pharisees to now Paul talking about this grammaton, this works of law. There is a direct correlation. People had this idea that Paul is bringing a different gospel, bringing different teaching, something that Jesus didn't get a chance to teach. And Paul is doing something different because it's now to the Gentiles as opposed to the Jews. And I just want to say through all these conversations that you create contradiction upon contradiction when you go that route. We've been dealing with that, and people, I mean, theologically, we've been dealing with the inconsistency and the weirdness of that for a long time. But I'm among many others are just beginning to take that contradiction seriously and say, listen, folks, we need to, that this isn't working. This is unsustainable. It's untenable. What we now know through a lot of good scholarship regarding Paul, as we've unearthed new evidences, giving us a better picture of the first century, what the Judaisms were like, what the issues that they were dealing with. we're beginning to see that traditional readings, even Catholic readings that go back to the third, fourth, centuries, are not connecting with they're reading anachronistically their own theological questions back into Paul, and thereby missing the a good exegetical path forward. So I hope that makes sense. So the reason why that went back to Romans 2 here is because he's talking about the letter grammaton, and it's through grammaton that these people are a transgressor, or this interlocutor is a transgressor of the law. So if we go back, there we go. 2 Corinthians 3. If we go back and we connect this, sorry about my mic there. We take a drink of water. So when we connect that discussion that Paul is having between circumcision, uncircumcision, obedience to the law versus disobedience to the law, brought about by adherence or reliance upon grammar, we can I believe it helps us to get a fuller understanding of what's happening in 2 Corinthians 3 with this midrash and how it relates to Paul's defense of his ministry. The ministers that are bringing different messages in a different way from Paul and the appointed apostles, the legitimate apostles, their ministry is a ministry of condemnation. It's a ministry of death. And it's a ministry that is related to a veiling of themselves and a veil, putting a veil over the people. And that veil leads away from life, and it leads towards death. I just think we can understand contextually that the death here, the condemnation, is in relation to disobedience. I don't think, again, we can ignore or disconnect this at all from the foundation in the Torah that if you walk in step with the Spirit and in keeping the commandments, there's life. If you disobey and walk in step and set aside, walk not in step with the commandments and set aside the law, brings condemnation. You're then under condemnation or under law. And if you continue in doing so without repentance, you're storing up wrath. Nothing remains but a fearful expectation of judgment and fiery wrath, as Hebrews puts it. So Paul is very rhetorically and skillfully and midrashically, I would say, implicating his opposition in the very opposite situation that they claim to be bringing. I mean, of course, they would be claiming to be bringing words of life and hoping and believing that what they're doing is beneficial, but what they're actually doing is veiling themselves and others. And what we don't see here, and I don't think what an honest reading of this passage in context can substantiate, is that Paul is in any way saying something negative about the law of Moses. He's saying more about stony hearts than he is about the commandments, in other words. And I just think, I mean, let me know in the chat. I mean, do you, is that not convincing enough? I'd like to hear your thoughts. Where else can we go here? I want to see. So going on into 4, and I think this is why the context matters, because he's just ended the midrash, and now what does he do? Does he talk about the badness of the law or anything like that? No, he says in verse 1 of chapter 4, therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart, but we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word. So stop there for a moment. Let's see. Let's hang on here for a moment. Paul is saying that we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word. So the obvious implication is that Paul is saying that these other so-called apostles, they are doing these things. They're coming in disgraceful, underhanded ways. They're practicing cunning and they're tampering with God's word. Does that sound like people who are coming to teach people that they have to obey the law of Moses? No. I mean, the law of Moses is not disgraceful. It's not underhanded ways. The law of Moses is not tampering with God's word. If anything, these people are bringing regulations and coming in a way that subverts the words and the commandments of God. They're doing something different. So why would the point of the midrash be to say law of Moses bad, law of Moses done away with? It would seem to undercut what he then would go on to say. Because if the law of Moses is set aside, why would it be bad for people to come with disgraceful, underhanded ways? It just doesn't make sense. But by the open statement of the truth, we would commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Messiah, who is the image of God. For what we proclaim is not ourselves. By implication, the ones who are coming with the letters of recommendation are proclaiming themselves, but not ourselves, but rather Jesus the Messiah as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And then I probably don't have to read on, but summarily what Paul goes on to talk about is now he's juxtaposing their outward appearance of being afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. So, let's see. So, Paul came with an open statement of the truth, not with veiled intentions. And it's so that people could see in these broken, weak, persecuted vessels that they would more clearly see the power of God. And this power of God, this glory of God, it is connected with sufferings. Why is that important? Because the one who paved the way to life, he himself suffered in his flesh. So Paul is saying the true measure of a sent one is one who acts and walks and endures like Messiah did. That's the message. That's the word of truth. Um, yeah. Okay. Karen says, Brother Jared, I completely agree, but not knowing history and understanding what Paul read, studied, and knew, I think you meant KNEU, EW, knew on a PhD level, it's difficult to understand him. Yeah, Paul, he was a PhD, that's for sure. And these things can be difficult to understand. I think what the I don't claim to fully have fully figured Paul out. In many respects, some of his theology is still an enigma to myself and those who have, as much as those who have studied Paul for decades and decades and decades. But what I can say is it's so important to get out of most systematic theologies and that type of approach to Paul, which is really just we come up with a framework and then we try to fit bits and pieces of Paul into it. And then the other parts that don't neatly fit, well, we end up with contradictions. I just think that that's what we see. So, what I like to do is what I'm, in many respects, what I'm demonstrating here is jumping over to I mean I stick in a context and I read the entire context and the rhetorical flow of it, its structure, so I really get a sense of the argument. If and I let Paul define his words for us. And if there's a word that we can't exactly, if we've spent as much time in a context as we can and we haven't yet figured out what a word means or what's the relation, then it's a good idea to go outside that passage and go to another place where Paul is using the same terms and look at the relations. Often, what that does, I mean, this happens a lot when you read Galatians and Romans side by side, and things that are just briefly mentioned in Romans he fully explicates in a more profound way in Galatians. And um, and maybe vice versa. But the point is, we stick in a context as long as we can, get as mine as much data points as we can, and then we can go to other passages. What we shouldn't do is rip little one-liners and 5-second sound bites out, and then build a doctrine out of it. So I hope that this is helping people do that. We do have to go past and go deeper than English translations. I'm not presenting you with the Greek necessarily because I've looked at these. I mean, you can go and check for yourself. When Paul talks about the letter kills, that's the Greek word gramma. And then you can go to other passages. There's just a few more passages where Paul mentions gramma or grammaton. And when you start to correlate these things together, you get a pretty good picture of the sort of paradigm or thing that this term grammaton becomes like almost sort of a metonym for, like a synecdoche, if you will. At 13 above 9 says, I believe the letter of the law refers to the written law, commandments on stone, which didn't save anyone but exposed their sins. Now we have that law written in our hearts, so we want to keep it. Yeah, I do understand that. I have a different, and I've come to different conclusions on what letter means. as I've stated, we don't find the phrase letter of the law um, in the scriptures. In fact, I mean, I think that if people follow what I've been presenting here, I think actually a better conclusion that I hope that people would come to is that letter is actually a reference to something outside of and apart from the law of Moses and the commandments. It's something that's originating from man. Um, and it is literally something that we're meant to be set free from. We're meant to be set free from letter, from grammaton. Um, I mean, if we go back to Romans 7, we read that through, and then we get into 8. Paul says that those who walk with their set mind, with their mind set on the Spirit, submit to God's law, whereas the one who has his mind set on the flesh does not submit to God's law, is hostile to God, and in fact cannot submit to God's law. The the conclusion that we should come to is that Paul is saying that we should submit to God's law, and that the way to do that is by walking according to the Spirit. And the law is spiritual. Paul says that in Romans 7:13. I mean, if the law is spiritual, you can't walk. I mean, it would be a non-starter to try to you can't keep the letter of the law as opposed to walk according to the Spirit. I mean, because to walk according to the Spirit is to walk in the commandments because they are spiritual. And yeah, I mean, I may not be presenting the understanding as well as I could, but yeah, I understand the correlation there. I mean, certainly it's a very compelling way to read 2 Corinthians 3, because Paul's immediately says the letter kills, and then immediately talks about letters inscribed on stone. I just want to say that we should be. I think we need to be careful with that because it is midrash. And again, as Karen said, Paul is a PhD in midrash and deeper levels of utilizing Hebrew texts, the Hebrew scriptures, to implicate his opponents in very rhetorical fashion. And midrash tends to take things and use them as symbols for something else in his immediate context. That's what midrash does. And what midrash doesn't do is be read in a plain sense that Paul is actually talking about the law of Moses. No, he's using gramma and stone as symbols for people's hearts and human regulations in relation to the law, and that this gramma veils their eyes. I don't think that neatly maps on to actual commandments. I think there's something else deeper going there, and so I'm hoping to compel people to search that out on a deep level. So, but I appreciate the engagement there, even if we disagree on that point. I don't get contentious on that. Karen says, if you do not study Torah and the prophets and writings, you cannot understand the apostles and Messiah. Then you build a doctrine. Yep. Mm-hmm. We build our own doctrines a lot of times. Let's see. Oh, I didn't want to miss this one. Yeah. Freddie says, right, spiritual in our hearts, desiring to keep the law and not break, transgress against the commandments of God. People broke the law because it's not in their hearts to keep them. Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Yeah. Jared, I always associated Paul's reference to the letters back to him being a Pharisee seeking letters to arrest believers. I could be wrong, though. Doing a great job. Yeah, thank you for the encouragement there. In fact, um, I actually think that that's what's going on. I think that's part of the rhetorical strategy. There is the letters of recommendation linked to what Paul used to do in his prior life in Judaism, as he calls it in Galatians chapter 1. He speaks of his former life in Judaism. He's very zealous for the traditions of the fathers. Notice he doesn't say very zealous for the law of Moses. He was zealous for the traditions of his fathers. That's a important data point there, I believe. So, as Karen said, yeah, Paul used to seek after letters, giving him the authority and recommendation from others to go and find those of the way and arrest them, put them in prison. Obviously, Paul looks upon that. He says that he blasphemed um, in talking to Timothy. He formally blasphemed. He I think it describes him in one place as having murderous intent. And Paul himself says that um, he was the chief example of God having mercy and saving a sinner. And he would have no part of that former way of doing things anymore, like that he has died to that. That's why he says in chapter 2 of Galatians, through law I died to law. Just like the same authority structures and regulations that compelled Jewish leader and Gentile leader alike to put Jesus to death. Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ. So Jesus died to those regulations. Paul is dying to them too. He's not going to operate in that way anymore. He has sold himself out to being a total bondservant of Jesus Christ to God. And so these letters, this letter written on stone, again, represents authority and glory from man that's with man. And it ends with man. Whereas the glory that Paul is bringing and the authority that he's operating in now as a servant of Jesus Christ, as an ambassador, comes from God and ends with flows back to God instead of to man. So yeah, I fully agree there. I think that is so important to see. Well, I don't have anybody wanting to come on and join in a panel discussion. I'll leave this up a little bit more. I'll see if there's anything else that I want to say. Maybe I'll go back to Romans 7 here. So, one thing that I do want um, to present and even just push back a little on, again, I think one of another reason why I have found, not just through my own studies, but also in really getting a grasp on what the state of Pauline scholarship through the Paul within Judaism scholarship, is that um, if we're to take the traditional reading, or what's often said that the letter refers to the actual letters written on stone, um, this this runs into problems because then we're saying we died to the letter of the law. The letter of the law brings death. When we don't find this at the foundation document, like the foundational documents in literature, the foundation of the Torah. We don't find anything like that. We don't find God describing this dynamic where, I'm giving you these commandments, and if if you try to just do the letter of them, it's going to produce death, and so you need to stop trying to do the letter and do the spirit. It's just it's not me being pedantic. It's just me being honest, where it doesn't seem like that is the picture that that Moses or God presents through Moses in regards to the law. We don't see that. What we do find is the problem very early on, and especially into the prophets, is that we don't find people being rebuked and God bringing judgment because people are doing the letter of the law versus not really doing the spirit. No, what we find is they're not doing the law. Um, there is a conception and an idea, and I used to think this way, that the real problem, the real issue with Israel in the Hebrew scriptures is that they were just too much about the law, um, and then they had to come to the reality that they couldn't do the law, and that's the whole point of the Old Testament, is that you can't keep the law, um, because they were trying so hard and just kept straying away. I think what's happening is they found loopholes around doing the commandments. They would fixate on certain things, um, and thought that that would give them a rationale or a reason to neglect weightier matters. So it's not a matter of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. It's a matter of neglecting the weighty matters of the law. Um, and most of it was doing what they thought was the law, but actually they were doing it in service to idols. And their service to idols was causing them to do fundamental disobedience to the commandments. And the prophets just don't give us a picture of Israelites being too focused on letters. What they find is they're neglecting the poor, neglecting justice, neglecting righteousness and mercy, and instead they are bringing lambs and sacrificing in bulls and goats and doing um, their convocations, not God's convocations. They're bringing their sacrifices, not the sacrifices that God instructed, actually. So they're not obeying the letter or the spirit, if we're to use that phrase. They're not even doing the letter. They're doing something else. Isaiah, which is quoted in let's see, in places like Mark 7 and Matthew 15, is Isaiah says, rebukes Israel, says, you honor me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me, teaching as doctrine the precepts of men. So these people are not, they're forsaking the Torah's instructions, they're forsaking God's words, and they're creating precepts and ordinances of their own. So they're creating their own convocations, their own Sabbaths, their own fasts, and they're doing those instead of the Torah. So I just, when I hear the traditional ways of reading Paul, I like to go back and see if that makes sense in light of the law and the prophets. And what I find time and time again is I find expressions that you just do not see at all in the law or the prophets. You find a different situation going on there, and that situation is actually one of thinking that you can set aside the commandments because you've invented a standard of righteousness of your own. Let's see. Larry Jackson, if priests tell the masses that the law came from God, then people would accept it. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. I don't know if you're able to elaborate on that. I'm curious what you mean or what you're getting at by that. If you can clarify if there's a particular passage that you're talking about, or yeah, I'd like to hear more. Yeah, and what I wanted to say at this point is, coming back to Jesus. If we go to a place like the Sermon on the Mount, let's go there to Matthew 5, and this will really touch on this common, traditional conception of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. Get a drink of water here. My throat is very dry. All right. So we all know the Matthew 5:17 through 20 part, but I want to really focus in on these antithesis statements that follow through the rest of chapter 5. He had just ended with talking about the one who relaxes one of the least of the commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them, the commandments, and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Then he goes into these antithesis statements. For instance, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. So a traditional way of reading this, especially in light of this traditional reading, this idea of the letter of the law versus spirit, people read the Sermon on the Mount as if Jesus is saying, you've heard the letter of the law, thou shalt not murder. But then he's going to say, well, no, there's a deeper spiritual matter. If you focus too much on the letter, then you're going to miss the spiritual. So don't focus on the letter. You need to do what matters is the spirit. You need to go beyond the letter of the law, in other words. But let me present something that would problematize that. The common conception is that Jesus is quoting the law of Moses, And then he's going to say, but I say to you, something different than the law of Moses, something deeper. But that's not actually what this is saying. When he introduces, you have heard that it was said, the law of Moses wasn't spoken. In other words, what I mean to say is, let me backtrack. What I mean to say is that whenever the law of Moses is referenced, they always say it is written, and then quote the law. The law of Moses was written. It's actually written for us. When he says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment, he's talking about something that some people are saying that has been said for a while. And he says, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Now, Yeshua is not juxtaposing a commandment with something spiritual. This verse 22, this is directly from the law of Moses itself. How do I know this? Well, let's go to Leviticus 19. And I'm going to read from verse 17. You must not harbor hatred against your brother in your heart. Directly rebuke your neighbor so that you will not incur guilt on account of him. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against any of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So compare that to verse 22. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. So Leviticus 19, 18, 19, 17, and 18 directly says you should not hate your brother in your heart. But you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus is not quoting a letter of the law and then trying to get to a deeper spiritual reality. What he's doing is he's speaking to those who are bringing a teaching to the people that says you shall not murder. But their teaching neglects a weightier matter in the law, which is not being angry and insulting and bearing a grudge against your brother, but loving your neighbor as yourself. It does no good, you shall not murder, if you're breaking the second greatest commandment, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. That's the point of this. There's a valuation and a degree. There's a valuation of the commandments. There's greater degrees, there's greater commandments, lesser commandments. That's why he says the two great commandments are love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's the second, which is like it. So let's go to another example. The next one. Many people might not understand, and again, this is a good idea to look at the Greek. Verse 27 of Matthew 5, you have heard that it was said, again, this is something that people are teaching. They're saying, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, again, we had to ask the question and question or bring it. We need to question our assumption. Is Jesus quoting a letter of the law and then trying to draw people towards a deeper spiritual intent behind the law? I would say again, no. Because if you look at the Greek, verse 28, that everyone looking upon a woman in order to lust after her. Now, this verb, epithemesai, that's the same Greek word in the Septuagint of Exodus 20 and the repeating of the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy. In Exodus 20, the 10th commandment, I'm sorry, not the 10th commandment, but the commandment that says you shall not covet your neighbor's wife or your neighbor's household or any of that sort of thing. That Greek word in the LXX of that verse is epithemesai. It's to covet. So a proper translation of this passage with that in mind is, but I say to you that everyone who envies or covets a woman has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So again, it's wrong to commit adultery, but it's also more fundamentally wrong to covet your neighbor's wife. And that's the point here. He's not upping the ante beyond the law. He's not going to some deeper spiritual intent of the law beyond the letter. No, he's saying it's not enough that you just say you shall not commit adultery when you can turn around and then covet your neighbor's wife. The one commandment is more fundamental and is weightier than the other. It's weightier to not covet. So that's the point. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. Let's see. That's actually just a couple of... we could also do love your enemies. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I would ask, where in the Torah can anybody find a statement or instruction in the Torah for you to love your neighbor and hate your enemy? I would say no. His response, I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Where might Yeshua be getting this from? Is he just going to some deeper spiritual reality? No, I don't think so. Because if we go to Exodus, I want to say, let's see. Let's go to Exodus 23. Verse 4. If you encounter your enemy's stray ox or donkey, you must return it to him. Verse 5. If you see the donkey of one who hates you fallen under its load, do not leave it there. You must help him with it. Let's see. Yeah, so my point would be there that the Torah itself instructs you to show love to even your enemies. So this teaching that the Pharisees supposedly are bringing, they're saying you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. The Torah does not command that. Rather, the Torah says for you to love your enemies, show love to your enemies, even in the matter of their animals. So he's drawing a principle directly from the Torah to something, He's not going from the letter to a deeper spiritual thing. He's actually just combating something that people are saying and teaching, and he's going back to the Torah and telling you, this is the weighty matter. This is what matters in the Torah. If anything, I mean, he's drawing people to the letter. It's like you can't just mouth that you well, I don't commit adultery. It's like, well, but you're coveting, and the law literally says you shall not covet. I mean, isn't that the letter of the law? I mean, is Jesus doing anything other than saying, here's the letter of the law? So I want to take that frame that Jesus is literally, he's going back to the letter of the law. And yeah. Karen says, in Deuteronomy, I have led you in the wilderness these 40 years to see if it's in your heart to obey me. It's always been about the heart. Yeah. Amen. Yeah. There is sort of an insidious idea that creeps in to the effect that the old covenant was about works and the new covenant is about the heart and the spirit and all this stuff. Like, nope. The covenant of the law of Moses and the covenant given at Sinai was a covenant of grace. It was a covenant of having the law written in your heart, walking according to the Spirit, having a circumcised heart. That was all. That wasn't created when Jesus came. It didn't. That's all part and parcel of the covenant at Sinai, which is a covenant that still operates today. It's still, it hasn't gone away, because the covenant that we have the first fruits of, which is the promise of the Spirit causing us to walk in all the commandments of the Lord, all the statutes and ordinances, and having them written on our heart. That's in conjunction with it's in conjunction and correlates with the covenant at Sinai. Hey, Tony, welcome. Glad to see you here. You guys, this is another channel, Tony Pino's channel, which is Keys of the Kingdom. That's what I meant to say. His channel is great. He's got a lot of great content. He says Yeshua is quoting from the Manual of Discipline from the Qumran sect. They held it was permitted to hate Gentiles. Yeah, there's yeah, I'm glad you said that. Yeah, definitely a lot of what we find developed within Jewish law, what we might call Jewish law, developed over a period of 200 years or so, spanning from the time of sectarian groups like that existed in Qumran, up to the time of the apostles, and much of what happened through the aftermath, I should say, of the Maccabean time and the Hasmonean dynasty. A strict regulation of Jewish separation and disdain for anything Gentile really fermented and fomented and cemented within the Jewish ethos, leading to an era of superiority, ethnocentrism, and a lot of the sectarian regulations really carried forward even long after the Qumran sects died out, so to speak. A lot of that sectarian mindset and disdain for anything that wasn't Jewish was sort of solidified in the Jewish ethos, leading to a lot of extra purity regulations, gatekeeping, and stuff like that. Even Gentiles who were God-fearers, who had turned to the Lord, who lived in proximity to the synagogues and were a part of the synagogue structure, they were held at arm's length, and many sectarian groups came in to try to compel Gentiles to be circumcised and come under their extra heightened purity regulations. All that was going on, especially around Judea. And then eventually these groups began to expand towards the latter end of the first century, and especially into the second century, into the diaspora. And Paul and others were combating that sort of mentality. All right, I'm probably going to give it another 10 minutes or so for anybody who wants to. I wait and see if there's anybody else who has joined who wants to. I have a link pinned in the chat to join. You can click on to join the StreamYard and come on up. And if you want to discuss in person or have questions or have pushback, I definitely invite that. All right, let's see. Yeah. So let's wrap that back together with what I was saying earlier about letter and spirit. A reoccurring dynamic that I think we see in the New Testament is especially as it relates to incorporating Gentiles into the faith and into the assembly, is that we already had sects of Judaism who had created a regulatory body of instructions, of regulations that gatekeeped in terms of identifying who were legitimate members of the covenant and who weren't. Even among Jews, I mean, there were Jews, sectarian Jews, who had scruples and regulations regarding purity, outside of which any Jew who wasn't acknowledging their authority and putting themselves in obligation to those regulations were considered Gentiles, sinners among the Gentiles. And that was an intra-Jewish thing. And then just think about how heightened that would be when you come to Gentiles who are wanting to come into and having hope in God and a place in the age to come, and having and no longer being strangers to God's covenants and promises, as it says in Ephesians 2:11-15. Imagine how much more so would this compulsion of Gentiles to come under these regulations. And what happens is these regulations become a group's own standard of righteousness. This is what Paul says. This is what Paul is referring to when he says that in Romans 10. Let's go there really quick. Paul, speaking of his desire for Israel, for I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge, for being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Now, this is very familiar or very similar to the language of Romans 8 previously, where Paul says the mindset on the flesh cannot submit to God's law. It does not and cannot submit to God's law. Because to submit to God's law is to submit to his righteousness. To not submit to God's law is to establish a law of your own, or a righteousness of your own. So we bring all that together. Let me hide that real quick. When we bring that all together, what we have is an entire system of regulations that are for the purpose of establishing and setting the standards of righteousness. And by virtue of that, setting aside God's righteousness and his commandments. This isn't new. This is what Yeshua struggled against. This is what he taught against. Pharisees would go over land and sea, far distances, to make a proselyte of a Gentile. And why did he do that? So the Pharisee could boast in the flesh of this proselyte. See, I made a convert. He got circumcised. And Jesus says that you make him twice the son of hell as yourself. That's rhetorically strong, biting language, but he has to get a message across that this is not the works of righteousness. This is not the deeds that are by the Spirit, but rather this is man glorifying man, flesh glorifying flesh. It's a righteousness of their own. It's not the righteousness of God. It's not obedience to the law. It's an obedience to a law of works. In other words, circumcision, proselyte circumcision. So I challenge people to come up with a better, a more coherent and sound way of reading Paul and Yeshua in these matters, because I don't think there is one. I've been through many different traditions and readings and trajectories and scholarship, and I don't find any of them tenable anymore outside of what we're seeing in Paul within Judaism. And that's essentially what I'm presenting here, is Paul within Judaism scholarship. Oh, let me. Let's see. Karen says there's one law for all who are in covenant with God. Ecclesiastes 12 is the duty of all mankind to obey the commandments of Yah, God. Jared, could new covenant be called renewed covenant? I mean, I'm not opposed to that principally. From a technical aspect, the Hebrew behind like, you know, the new moon, there's a difference between grammatically and meaning between an adjectival new versus other, like I think the expression renewed moon essentially is what people try to connect with this idea of the renewed covenant, but it doesn't work grammatically, linguistically. From a technical standpoint, I think the argument can still be made, but I think many people, scholars at least, would tend to discount that rendering of the new for grammatical reasons. And I mean, I think there's weight to that, but I don't land one side or the other on that. I mean, I think on principle, it's good to say that it is fine to say that what God is doing is renewing the covenant. The reason why Jeremiah 31 says that God says it's not like the covenant I made with your fathers is because, not because the covenant is different, but because the people are different. He's making a covenant with a new people, and he's renewing the covenant with a people that have been made new. So I that's how I handled that. Hey, David, good to see you here. How do you see letter versus spirit in Pauline literature? Oh man, that's probably like the first hour and 10 minutes of this stream. We're at an hour and 50 minutes now. So you basically missed um, all that, but I'll sum up a couple points. Letter versus spirit. Letter is grammaton, gramma, and spirit is pneuma. And the first point is we don't see the phrase letter of the law versus spirit of the law in Paul's letters or anywhere in the New Testament. But particularly with gramma, with letter, I find that the second point is that I find it as a synecdoche, as sort of a catch-all term for man-made regulations and attempts to um, to um, to regulate through various authority and legislation a sort of how to legislate righteousness. It's like create. I think it's. I mean, it's another technical term that I think it's related to works of law, and law of works. And the reason why I say that is because the first time we see this in Paul's writings is Romans 2, where he said in verse 27, he says, therefore the uncircumcised person who keeps the law will stand in judgment and condemn you who through the letter and circumcision are a transgressor of the law. So Paul makes this curious statement that it's through letter and circumcision that one becomes a transgressor of the law, and that the letter was, literally the letter of the law. Like if you're just trying to obey the law by its letter, why would that mean you're transgressing the law? It doesn't make any sense. But Paul seems to be saying that grammaton here is something that leads you away from the commandments and into something different. It's sort of a righteousness of your own. And that would be what Paul would equate that with in Romans 7 when he brings up letter again. Is he calls that the oldness of the letter. Well, there's something that we need to be delivered from, and that's the body of death. The letter kills, as he says. He also says in Romans 7 that the law of Moses doesn't kill. He asked the rhetorical question, did that which is good become death to me? He says, heck no, by no means. So it's certainly not the law of Moses that is the ministry of condemnation. It's not the law of Moses that kills. It's another law at work in your members that he describes in verse 23 of the same chapter. And we need to be delivered from the law of sin and death and this other law that's at work in our members and that produces a body of death. We need to be delivered from this body of death, and thanks be to God. The way that we're delivered from the body of death and this other law at work in our members is to walk according to the Spirit, which does submit to God's law. So I know that's a lot, but I tried to sum up as much as possible in my presentation. Larry, you said the law originated from priests, not God. The priests told the people that the law came from God to con them to accept it. Yeah, I don't agree at all there. it. I mean, just a quick question: Are you sort of a person who holds to like the quote unquote lying pin of the scribes? Um, is that sort of when you get what you're getting at? It almost sounds a little bit kind of like what some of the stuff that Ross Nichols presents. I mean, um, I'm not averse to talking about that, but I don't I don't get that at all. I mean, I don't understand that vein of thinking. It seems conspiratorial. Um, I just don't get that sense. I'm being honest. I don't see that at all in the scriptures. Um, I mean, it's kind of an interesting meta narrative, but it seems to. I find too much contradiction in that view, but I'm always happy to talk about it. Again, I'm probably going to wrap up here soon because nobody seems to be coming on wanting to join and discuss in person. But let me get through the rest of these comments here. And Tony asks, do you hold the tablets of stone reflect a stone heart? Yes. Yeah. Midrashically, again, when the purpose of a midrash is to take elements from one domain and then map them onto the domain in the situation that the midrash is meant to address. And in this instance, the tablets of stone represent the hearts of stone that these other ministers produce. They don't produce hearts of flesh because they veil themselves. And the point of the veil that he's bringing out is that when Moses veiled himself, the people didn't want to look intently on the glory that shone on his face, even though fading as it was. So you have this picture of people not being able to see Moses because of their hearts of stone. And he maps that onto the intentions and the motives of the so-called apostles, these others that are attacking Paul. And he's saying, well, they veil their intentions, they veil their message, and it leads to people having veil over their own eyes. Paul says, we who are with unveiled eyes, we actual apostles, we don't come with veiled intents. We speak boldly. We came with open statements of the word of truth, and we didn't come with pomp and circumstance. We came with power and the Spirit. And so when we help people turn to the Lord, the veil is removed and people can see Moses clearly, so that they can then see Messiah clearly, because Moses wrote of Messiah. So the people need to see Moses properly, and that's the point. He's not speaking bad against the tablets. I mean, that's just not the point of a midrash, and I think you understand that, brother. But I appreciate the question because you're getting at how the midrash functions, and we really need to understand that. Larry, you said Paul has no authority. Paul never met JC. I mean, on the one hand, I mean, I get it, man. I understand where you're coming from. If you're okay answering in the chat, I get, maybe I'm getting the sense more that maybe do you kind of identify like with the Ebionites in that regard, rejecting the apostleship of Paul? I'm not a Pauline apologist. I'll just say that up front, and that's why I open my response to you with, I mean, I get it. I've been studying Paul's writings for years, for decades, literally, and I've been trying to find a basis to reject Paul, and that that endeavor has led me away from traditional readings of Paul, because the more that I've studied Paul, the more that I just realize that the very reasons people reject Paul are because of bad readings of Paul. Why should we grant the traditional readings when modern scholarship is showing them to be completely untenable, without basis and anachronistic? And so, the more that I've addressed the question in my own studies, the very challenge that you're bringing up, the more that I've found I cannot find a single reason to reject Paul, or to say that he had no authority. I mean, he is literally teaching the same thing that Jesus taught in every respect. And I say that with respect, brother. I mean, I just think you're totally off. And I was and God love us. I mean, I thought sort of the same thing too. I mean, I read Paul the same way, and like many Christians at the time, um I didn't take the discontinuity seriously. I just said, well, I just try to explain it away or rationalize it away. But I just came to a point where I had to come to grips and look at this seriously. And the more I did look at it, and I submitted myself to this challenge, um, of finding contradiction in Paul, and every time I hear an objection, I search it out, I study for myself, and I realize that, wow, that was just a total misreading of Paul. I mean, I'm just being honest with that. So I always encourage people to, um, set aside traditional readings and look at some of the modern scholarship on Paul, and I think you'll be, um, surprised by what you find. So take that for what it's worth. Uh, the Lord bless you in your own studies. Uh, I don't necessarily fault you for rejecting Paul or saying that he had no authority. I get it. Um, Salvation is not in Paul. So, I'll just leave it at that. Let's see. David, you said sometimes people don't get how the old covenant, quote unquote, is a reference to them making a covenant with death. Isaiah talks about it. Um, I think I can kind of see that. I definitely like to have a conversation with you about that, because I might not be making the same connections or understanding the connections that you're making there. Um, but yeah, I'd like to definitely have a conversation with you at some point, to talk about that, because I'm I'm not really. I mean, on an abstract level, I mean, I can kind of see that. I might see where you're coming from, but maybe you can help me kind of direct me through, because I know you do a good job of connecting a lot of scriptures together. So, I'd love to have that conversation with you at some point. Yeah, no, I mean, I totally get, in context, the what you're talking about, from Isaiah's context about, annulling your covenant with death. Um, let's see. Spirituality is beyond consciousness. Um, well, I mean, to me, I just, um, sure. I mean, I'll give you that. I think I understand. It's all good. Yeah. Yeah, David, hit me up, some, here, let me put my email, um, my email in the chat. So if you want to send me an email, let me know your email, and we can kind of coordinate. Because yeah, I'd definitely like to um, do an episode with you, or just have an off 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 the record conversation. Love to catch up with you sometime. Which Lord? Which Lord? Which Lord are you having them turn to? That's a interesting call sign there. Which, well, I would say, oh, you're probably referencing when Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3, when we turn to the Lord, the veil is turned away. I mean, I would say it's I would say the Lord in reference there is Yahweh. Is the Yod He Vav He there? Now some would say, "Oh, I mean, isn't it the Lord Jesus?" And I'm like, "Well, I mean, Yahweh's name is in Yeshua, Yehoshua. The Lord's name is literally in His name. So when we believe the Lord Jesus, and when we confess the Lord Jesus and believe that God raised Him from the dead, we are calling upon the name of Yahweh, because Yahweh's name is in Him. He is the representative of Yahweh. He is the one Yahweh has made, Lord and Messiah. So when we do so, we are calling upon the name of the Lord, because Yahweh is Lord of both the Jews and the Greeks. He is Lord of all. And richly blesses all who call upon His name. So, I mean, that's how I answer that. Let's see. Anything else going on here? The issue, where does Paul get authority? I mean, we could go back and forth on that all day, but I think that the greater, the more fundamental question is, what did Paul write? And I think he wrote and agreed exactly with the teachings of Yeshua, the law and the prophets. He spoke nothing against the law and the prophets, and did not contradict the law or the prophets or Jesus. Again, popular readings have him contend otherwise, but I've tested all those through rigorous exegesis, and I find them all to be not faithful to the text. Amen, David. Paul is advanced far beyond the average person today. Most people shouldn't be reading Paul, in my honest opinion. I agree. I get what you're saying. I agree with many who say that the order of reading the scriptures is Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, then go back and read in the entire foundational document, which is the first half of the Bible, and then read the other apostles, the epistles, and then at the very last, then read Paul's letters. He should be last in the pecking order. That's my take. Yeah. Let's see. David says, yeah, we could dispute anybody's authority in the Bible, especially some Old Testament figures, if we wanted to get super technical. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yahweh said He'd be the Messiah. No. Sorry, can't get on board with that stuff. I get where you're coming from. I used for about 2 months, I used to do the Trinitarian apologetic stuff, but it didn't last long because the more I looked into it, the more I tried to do it, the more I realized what I was having to do to the text to make it work with that sort of Trinitarian ideology. It doesn't work, and I had to stop doing that because it was not faithful to the Bible. But anyways, so we're just past the 2-hour mark. I think because nobody has wanted to come on and discuss in the panel. I think I've pretty much exhausted everything that I wanted to present in terms of letter versus spirit. Yeah, David, I know you missed a lot of that, and but hopefully you can go back and watch this or listen to it to get a better sense of where I'm coming from with that and my conclusions. But with that said, I think I'm going to go ahead and end it here. Thank you all for engaging in the chat. Thank you, David and Karen and Larry and Freddie and Tony. Bless you all. And again, I really encourage people to test these things and to bring afresh into question traditional readings of Paul, and understand that, look at the contradictions that I'm pointing out here with the traditional readings. If we're taking a passage like 2 Corinthians 3 and saying that Paul is saying that the law of Moses is the ministry of condemnation and a ministry of death, we need to square that, or try to reconcile that with what he says elsewhere, which he denies that the law is death, that the law is sin, or the law brings death. No, there's another law at work in you, and this law is associated with grammaton and other technical words that Paul uses in other places. It's just I hope it gives you tools and to maybe come at these passages with a broader breadth of Paul's writings in mind, instead of treating them as little. We tend to rip out these little lines here or there that seem to fit our theology and our narrative. So I'm here to challenge that and help people refine their reading of the scriptures. So I hope I've done that, and I hope you all are blessed. Have a wonderful night and the rest of your week, and shalom. Hey folks, if you enjoyed this episode and the content, please like the video and leave a comment below, and definitely subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you can be sure to catch more content like this as it comes. Until next time, think deep.